Get started. I would like to welcome everyone to our 2021 Dallas Dealmaker April program presented by the Women in ACG DFW. My name is Abby Fuqua, your current ACG DFW Women's Chair, as well as a Vice President with Venturity Financial Partners. We have a few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. You have been automatically muted, and we ask you to stay muted throughout the content portion. We also recommend that you watch in speaker view, which you can update in your top right corner of your Zoom window. If you have questions for our panel, please use the chat box function. The chat box should only be used for questions. You can send private messages if you have greetings to send to people. And if you have any other questions or issues, please send a private message to Brittany Timmerman with ACG DFW. And I'll go off script for a second to say, please keep your videos on as well. I think that always makes these virtual events more engaging. So I would like to take a moment to thank the awesome Women's Committee who has put this event together, and special thank you to Rachel and Gerto with Bank of America, who you'll meet in a moment. We appreciate all of your hard work on this event, and the rest of the Women's Committee too really rallied to make today great. So as you all know, we have really high caliber members, and it's the true reason we are here. And it's my honor to welcome our new members in attendance, Christina Ballard with Plunk Smith and Travis Haynes with Origin Bank. So welcome to ACG DFW. Also, we could not bring you these outstanding content programs without the support of our sponsors. So I'd like to take a moment to thank our 2020-2021 Dallas Dealmaker Series sponsors. Our platinum sponsors, Calvetti Ferguson and Haynes and Boone. Our gold sponsors, BDO, Insperity, Perkins Coie, and Winston and Strawn. And then our women's series sponsors, Bank of America and Insperity. Thank you all for your continued support of ACG DFW. If you are in a breakout room during networking with any of our sponsors, please thank them for their sponsorship. So speaking of sponsors, it's my pleasure to welcome Rachel and Gerto with Bank of America to give you an update on what they've been up to. Rachel, I will turn the video over to you.
Thank you. Bank of America is proud to be a sponsor of the ACG of Dallas-Fort Worth Women's Series. As more attention is being directed towards the non-financial metrics of companies, this panel discussion should be very insightful. At Bank of America, we are guided by a common purpose to help make financial lives better through the power of every connection. We deliver on this through a focus on responsible growth and environmental, social, and governance leadership. Through these efforts, we are driving growth, investing in the success of our employees, helping to create jobs, develop communities, foster economic mobility, and address society's biggest challenges, while managing risk and providing a return to our clients and our business. In Fortune's recent Change the World report, Bank of America was recognized as the top global bank and 15th overall for our innovative business strategies and investments in social capital that has positively impacted the world. At Bank of America, ESG means we're helping society transition to a low carbon economy and supporting sustainable business activities. We're helping communities and individuals thrive by advancing economic and social progress and by being a great place to work. We're committed to best practices in corporate governance, and our employees play an important role in our commitment to acting ethically and living to our code of conduct. Some examples of our ESG leadership and credentials are deploying capital to help our clients pursue ESG ambitions. In 2019, we issued a $500 million social bond to create housing for families and communities. In addition, we have helped our clients finance over $50 billion in green bonds overall and over $20 billion in ESG-related bonds in 2019 to 2020 alone. Last month, Bank of America announced a $250 million increase to the commitment to advance racial equality and economic opportunity. This 5-year, $1.25 billion commitment further accelerates work already underway in this area through direct actions, investments, and work to catalyze similar efforts across the private sector. Bank of America also has a history of inclusion, which is demonstrated in who we are today. Our global management team is 54% female, and Bank of America is one of only 5 S&P 100 companies with 6 or more women on the board. Our partnership with more than 40 organizations globally to promote diversity and inclusion in the communities we serve, and our support and growth of our 11 bank-supported employee networks that currently connect 250 chapters across the globe. In addition to our advisory services and expertise in this area, we are proud to offer products and solutions with an ESG focus. These include digital banking capabilities, ESG-focused investments, ESG-focused project financing, ESG capital market solutions. We know many companies are already considering the impacts of climate change, diversity and inclusion, and how business is conducted. Your Bank of America contact can share more details of our commitment to ESG and connect you with our subject matter experts for a detailed discussion on ESG. And now I'll turn it back over to Abby.
I'm on mute, sorry. Thank you, Rachel. We really appreciate you and Bank of America's support of ACG DFW, and that was an awesome segue to today's panel. So as you all can see, sponsors are the key to our programs and bringing relevant and important content and networking programs to our members. If you're interested in sponsorship of a virtual or in-person event, because those are happening again, please contact Brittany Timmerman with ACG DFW. Okay, I know you're ready to get started. Here's the agenda. We'll begin with the moderated discussion and then move into your questions that you're giving us in the chat box. And then we'll finish with a structured small group networking. You can sit back and relax until we move into the networking portion. Once you move into your breakout room, you'll need to unmute yourself, and that's it. So now we can get on with the program. I'm really happy to introduce you to today's moderator, Jennifer Coelho with Eisner Amper, and my co-chair for the Women's Committee. Jen, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby, and welcome everyone. As Abby mentioned, I'm Jen Coelho, co-chair of the ACG DFW Women's Committee and senior manager in the financial services group at Eisner Amper LLP. Eisner Amper is a leading full-service accounting, advisory, and tax firm and among the nation's largest accounting firms. We provide professional services to a broad range of clients across many industries, including the financial services industry. But Eisner Amper is far more than a business, accounting, and advisory firm. We are dedicated to being a positive force in the communities where our people live and do business. And I wanted to quickly mention just a few of our socially responsible initiatives. We recently opened a brand new state-of-the-art headquarters in New York City last year at 733 3rd Avenue, a LEED Gold certified building. The firm's office was designed with wellness, flexibility, and sustainability in mind to provide employees with a technology-driven workplace of the future. To better provide an environment for all employees to fulfill their career and life objectives and to advance within the firm, we've expanded our employee resource groups, or ERGs. Our ERGs offer both internal and external resources, programming, and networking opportunities to support the career development of team members as they build successful business relationships. Eisner Amper Cares is our firm-wide initiative that encourages and supports the volunteer efforts of the firm's employees in their communities. And finally, we recently formed an ESG consulting team and ESG reporting group to assist our clients in creating ESG strategies and helping companies measure and report key ESG metrics. It is with this spirit that it is a pleasure to be moderating today's panel on the rise of ESG and impact investing. We have 4 amazing panelists that I'm incredibly excited to speak to. So without further ado, I'd like to kick it over to our first panelist, Debbie, to introduce herself and explain how her role and what she does relates to our topic today. Debbie?
Great, thanks, Jen. Thank you for having me here today. I founded SDS about 20 years ago, where we are an impact fund manager. And so that's a little bit what I'll focus on today, is how we invest our capital into some of the poorest communities of the country, but at the same time seek market rates of return for our investors. So it's a real way to do good and do well at the same time, and focus on impacts that perhaps your company may want to help achieve. I've always been involved in economic development. That's really been the focus of my career. And the way I got into this space was I was assistant deputy mayor for economic development in the 90s. And Los Angeles, where I continue to live today, just did not have the resources to attack the poverty that we were confronting and still confront, frankly. And what we did in Mayor Reardon's administration is that we need to enlist the private sector, because there's not enough government money, there's not enough nonprofit money to really get to the root and start creating the jobs and economic opportunity we need for our poorest communities. So I was really fortunate. I was tapped. I was tapped to figure out how to create these types of, at the time they were called double bottom line funds. There was no impact industry. There were no investors looking to do impact investments, but we convinced them, and we raised 3 different funds. a commercial real estate fund, a workforce housing fund, and a fund for small manufacturers. And fortunately, I was embedded in that, and it led me to pivot my entire career to focus on how do we bring the private sector to the table in the battle against poverty across the country. So in 2001, I founded SDS, and today we manage over $1 billion in 5 different impact funds, different parts of the country, each targeting a different investment strategy, either manufacturing companies or real estate. And we typically invest in communities with an average of 35% poverty and about 70 to 75% minorities. So we're really focused on impoverished minority communities, but generating risk-adjusted rates of return. And I'm happy to say we have 2 of our funds overlap in Texas. So 15 of our 72 investments are in Texas. It's been a really big market for us to focus our resources. So thanks again.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm going to turn it over to Whitney.
Trying to unmute. Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. And I was excited to hear Debbie's story because, like Debbie, my history goes back quite a ways also. And in the mid-90s, I was focused on the women entrepreneur and the women business owner community. And we discovered that there was no source of private equity or venture capital money specifically targeted to helping women entrepreneurs. So I came from this from a public policy standpoint. How do we change that and provide growth capital to women-led companies? And so I got involved in that mission and started actually what became the first fund in the country to specifically target investing in women entrepreneurs. And back in the mid-90s, we found that the banks were just sort of waking up to this notion of helping women entrepreneurs as a community, and they became our initial investors to launch what at the time was a very small, and we called it a mission-driven fund. Now the term is impact investing, but back then it was called mission investing. And then we evolved over time to start to focus on who our investors were. So we shifted from the institutional model to one to provide a opportunity to educate and provide a mechanism for women to become investors in private equity and venture capital. Because one of the things we discovered was that there were quite a few men who were experienced in early stage in private equity, but they also had opportunities to invest in the brand name funds and firms. So we started a fund in Texas with the mission to help women learn about this area of investing and also to make an impact with their investing. So we were sort of cool before anybody knew what the terminology was. And we remained a very small, targeted, mission-driven fund, but we had multiple impacts, not only impacting in the women that we were investing in, but oftentimes investing in products and services that particularly helped women and educating our women investors so that now they're aware of and looking for opportunities to invest in the public market. Now that there's a focus on ESG, it's more aligned with some of their mission to have an impact in their investment, whether or not it's a direct investment or an investment through the public market. So we're very excited to see the evolution of the marketplace and the impact investing that's happening at all levels, and in particular the very strong movement in the public and larger company, privately owned company models that are using ESG as a tool to improve the value of their companies, but also to direct their investing towards social causes that matter to them as a company. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Whitney. We're very excited to have you. Stacy, you are next.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks for having me today. I'm Stacy Doré. I am the CEO of Sherryland Utilities, which is a transmission-only utility in ERCOT, or Texas. We have transmission assets that deliver electric energy in the South Texas area. Sherryland is a joint venture between the Hunt family of companies, and Sempra Energy out of California. It's 50-50 owned by Hunt and Sempra. The Hunt Energy is a portfolio of energy companies owned by the Ray L. Hunt family here in Dallas. And Hunt Energy invests across a wide variety of energy resources, including oil and gas production and exploration, LNG facilities, and then electric power assets, including a battery storage company that we recently started. I am, in addition to running Sherryland Utilities as one of our business units, I'm the Senior Vice President of the Power and Utilities Group for Hunt Energy. So we have power assets outside of Texas as well, including a wind farm in Costa Rica and some other assets. And so I've been in the energy industry for a while. And obviously our industry is one of the real focal points for ESG efforts these days. And I think a lot of companies are kind of midway through that journey. Others are just waking up to it. It kind of varies across that industry. In addition to my executive roles, I am a board member of Williams, which is a publicly traded company based in Tulsa. It's a midstream gas company. It has about 30,000 miles of natural gas infrastructure across 25 states, 5,000 employees. And I'm proud to say I joined the board in January, and it really is on the cutting edge of kind of ESG programs in the midstream space. It's a company that's looking at things like renewable natural gas, getting hydrogen mixed in with our natural gas in the pipelines. And so I sit on the committee of that board, the governance and sustainability committee that actually oversees ESG efforts for the company. So both in my executive role at a private company like Sherryland, in which we focus as well on ESG, and then in my role as an independent director of a public company that's very focused on ESG, I kind of bring the company side of the ESG insights to today's panel. So I'm not out there, investing in funds or projects like some of the other panel members, but I'm looking at it from the company side as to how do we both do the right thing from an ESG perspective, but also how do we measure that and communicate that to our shareholders as well as our other stakeholders in the company. So happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Stacy. And I agree. I'm really happy about all the different perspectives that we have on this panel. I think it's very exciting. It's going to lead to a great conversation. And last but not least, our sponsor, thank you again, Danielle.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Danielle Ward. I'm an institutional portfolio manager in the private bank at Bank of America. So I actually work with nonprofit clients and across the country, including right here in Dallas. And I advise them on everything from investment policy to asset allocation to portfolio construction. I focus on sustainable or ESG and mission-aligned investing. And I'm really passionate about helping my clients align their investment portfolios with their values and their mission. So what I see working with nonprofit organizations is that, they're increasingly interested in how integrating ESG and impact investing into their portfolio can help them better position for the long term and also help them pursue their mission, more holistically. But despite this, there seems to be this gap between interest and implementation. So I try to help them bridge that gap by working with them to develop a plan that fits with their risk appetite, mission, investment objectives. Most of the time, I work with clients in their public markets portfolio, which is a little bit different from some of the other ladies on the panel. And while this isn't always the most exciting, part of ESG and impact investing, it is an important one. So, first, most portfolios have an allocation, to public stocks and bonds as a core piece of their portfolio. And the second is that there's a lot of options, right, in the public markets, and they're pretty easily accessible. You don't have to have a lot of assets in order to invest there. So it can really be a great place to start. So that's the perspective I come from today.
Thanks, Danielle. And again, very excited to have you all here today. And thank you for taking the time. So Whitney, to give everybody a baseline, What exactly are ESG and impact investing? And are they the same concept, or are there some differences? And I'm sure there's some people who signed up for the event that, might think that they're exactly the same thing. And I think we had a great conversation on that. So can you start us off there?
Well, I think whether it's ESG or emission driven, it's investing with the purpose to have an impact. And those impacts are personal to the investor, whether or not it's a company or an individual. What influence are they trying to exert with their capital? And capital is very influential. It directs social policy. It directs solving problems that we have, whether or not it's an economic disparities or the differential between what men and women receive access to as capital, let's say. So it can solve some social injustice or economic issues, but it's very powerful in how you invest your money, whether or not it's how you do it individually or through your corporate treasury has influence and impact. And so to me, it's all about impact investing. But we tend to refer to impact investing as something discrete from ESG because ESG has become associated a lot with your mid-sized companies, your public companies, your larger companies, and what they are doing to have an impact with how they behave inside of their companies. And we were doing that early on in the 90s. We called it investing in women who had a high, certain value system and how they managed their company. And they were very employee centric. They were very supplier, customer centric. And later that became known as conscious capitalism. It took a guy to put a label around it, but that's what, in effect, we were investing on long before it had a title. So part of what we were doing was we were looking for the governance, we were looking for the value system that the company's leadership had and their ethics and what they were going to do with this capital. And so that as that became a more mature concept, it started to have labels around it. And as it became more widespread, then companies started saying we have a role to play in this, and it became known as ESG. So for those who deal with ESG inside of the corporate world, there'll be a great follow on to what I'm saying as far as we all have an impact. We're just impacting in different ways, but that is all related to impact investing.
Stacy, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, Jen, thanks. We had a good discussion about this as you referenced, and I had not really ever, put a lot of thought into the difference because being on the company side, ESG has been something that we've thought about for a number of years. And now having deliberately thought about it, I do think there's a difference. And Whitney kind of alluded to this. To me, impact investing can be, as the name implies, it can be investing with a purpose to impact a particular issue. It doesn't necessarily cut across, all of ESG. It could be on women's issues. It could be on poverty issues. And so I think impact investing to me is, from an investor perspective, using your capital to affect a certain change in the world. Whereas ESG, I think, is more focused on, as the name implies, it's environmental social governance, which is a broad swath of categories. But from a company perspective, to me, ESG is figuring out kind of what action we want to take in those areas. How do we measure those actions and the effectiveness of them? And then how do we, most importantly, perhaps, how do we communicate to our various stakeholders what we're doing in those areas and how what we're doing adds value to the company? So, one of the things that I always say about ESG is I've been in the energy industry for about 15 years. And I'm fortunate to say that, at all of the companies I've been with, for a long time, we have been focused on doing the right thing and measuring our impact in the ESG area. What we weren't always good at was communicating that to investors and to stakeholders. And I think that's where companies have gotten a lot better. because there's been pressure to do so, especially for public companies. But even in a private company like I'm with now, we talk a lot about the fact that we don't have, the Glass Lewis's and ISS and BlackRock's and institutional investors pressuring us to disclose our ESG efforts because we're not public. But we still have an imperative on ESG from our vendors, from our customers, and importantly from our employees. I think particularly in today's world, some of the younger generations, it spans all generations, but the talent that we're competing for, they care about ESG. They ask questions about ESG. We need to be able to articulate as a company why they should want to come work for us in terms of the impact that we're having on the environment, on social issues, on governance issues, and in our local communities. And one of our values as a private company is being community centric. And that means, we need to be having a positive impact in our community. So I think that while the ESG buzzword and effort seems more recent, I think a lot of companies, not all, but a lot of them have been doing the work for longer than it might seem, but have not always done a good job of sort of, disclosing metrics and also just communicating well how we're doing those efforts. So to me, the ESG piece is really, again, what are we doing to affect change in those areas, and how is that adding value to our enterprise?
Thank you, Stacy. And that's actually an excellent segue to our next question is really, how can each of you tell us within your space what your goals are with ESG or your impact investing strategies, how you track against those goals, and again, with your segue, how do you measure success with your initiatives? And we'll start off with Danielle on this one.
Great, thanks. So when we work with clients, we ask them what would they like the power to do through their portfolio? And the framework that seems to resonate is, because it's pretty simple, is avoid, benefit, or contribute. So you can, for example, for avoid, you could avoid areas that you see as risky or not aligned with your values, right? So for instance, maybe tobacco. You could benefit by investing in stronger ESG companies. So maybe some that have more efficiency in water, energy use, or maybe that have more diverse management teams. And then you can contribute by investing in companies that actually are, creating solutions to some of the challenges like healthcare, renewable energy, et cetera. So we help clients, figure out what kind of impact they want to have, and then match that to the investment solutions that we're using with them. And then we can look at the portfolio and say, all right, how much your portfolio is avoiding, how much is benefiting, how much is contributing. We also can help clients express the alignment of their investment program to the 4 pillars that were recently developed by the World Economic Forum's International Business Council, which Bank of America's CEO, Brian Moynihan, actually co-chairs that. So they came up with 4 pillars that are people, planet, principles of governance, and prosperity. You can kind of tie those back to the ES and G, right? But these are things that companies across the world in different industries are actually going to start disclosing their ESG metrics in those 4 areas. So it's going to be easier to then tie back, a client's portfolio to those things, or a company's metrics to those 4 pillars over time. And the 4 big accounting firms are involved in that effort too. So I think we're going to see more and more with those 4 pillars. And then those can also get tied back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I know a lot of people also use to try to quantify and show where their impact is. But when we are investing clients' portfolios, from a financial perspective, we're going to focus solely on investments that seek market rate returns with our clients. And we believe that you don't have to give up financial return to invest with a sustainable or an ESG lens. So any of the solutions that we're putting in our portfolios are going to meet our risk and return expectations first, before we're considering the ESG or social environmental impacts. So for that reason, when we are measuring their returns, right, their risk and their returns, we are going to measure that against what you could say are traditional benchmarks. and also asset class specific peer groups, just because we don't think that they should be measured against a different type of benchmark from a financial performance perspective. We want to make sure that they're getting the same types of returns and the same type of risk than if they were not, using an ESG lens. So overall, basically, we're really trying to give clients the power to either avoid, benefit, or contribute to those positive social and environmental effects, but we also want to make sure they're achieving the competitive financial returns.
Thanks, Danielle. And Debbie, what about you on the fund side?
Yeah, so as a manager of impact funds, I feel that the goals can sometimes be misperceived, especially with new investors coming into this space, or an investor we approach that has never made an impact investment. And for me, impact investing has two goals: financial performance and the impact outcomes. And the financial performance, for me, without financial performance, there is no impact, because investors will stop giving you their capital because you're not being a financial steward. And in fact, our tagline is, driven by impact, grounded in financial stewardship. So for us, achieving the risk-adjusted rate of return that's in the private placement memorandum is really important, but it's also very measurable. I mean, the funds are audited, the returns are very clear, there's standards. What becomes, so that is a key goal of ours, is to really underwrite every investment as deeply as a non-impact manager would be doing, to asset manage through the life of the investment, to step in when needed, and to protect our investors' capital. What's harder to sort of quantify sometimes is the impact outcomes, depending on what type of project. But for us, that's really important as well. We do deep impact reporting on every single project. We have dozens and dozens of metrics that we report on, from the poverty rate of the community, the percentage of the population that's minority. If it's a hospital, we find out how many low-income individuals will be served annually by that hospital. If it's a charter school, what's the percentage of low-income students, minority students that will be served by it? The environmental outcomes, is it an environmentally sustainable project? How, why, what is it doing to achieve the different goals on the individual project? So reporting is very central. And a couple of examples, just to give an idea, when I say impact investing for our funds. So for instance, after Hurricane Katrina hit, one of our very first investments was in the Ochsner Hospital in New Orleans. That hospital served more low-income residents than any other hospital in New Orleans. And here it was shut down. So we put in $10 million to get their surgical unit back up and running. In Dallas, a little closer to home for many of you, in South Dallas, where the poverty rate is 45% and 95% minority population, we funded Emmett Smith. His firm, E. Smith Communities, is very aligned with us, focuses on emerging minority communities. And we funded a shutdown commercial building right next to the Veterans Administration, where now UNT and a community college have space for community training and other community services there. And that's been a great partnership, working with a developer that's highly aligned and wanting to impact low-income communities. But even a commercial project, such as an investment we invested recently in Selma, Alabama, 55% poverty there, just staggering poverty. Most of the downtown is boarded up. And of course, Selma, Alabama, we all know it's one of the most central sites for our civil rights history. So we funded a historic hotel right next to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where the protesters were beaten in 1965. We're bringing it back to life. So now there's going to be 65 hotel rooms where tourists can stay overnight. Right now, they blow through Selma on the Civil Rights Trail. They come look at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they walk through the boarded up town, they get on their bus and they go. Now they'll be able to stay in the town. Local entrepreneurs can open up restaurants, food services, retail. So it'll be very, very catalytic. But at the same time, on all those projects, we're achieving risk-adjusted rates of return for our investors, and their capital's making a difference. So I think that those are really important, that we always measure very carefully upfront what the impact outcomes will be, but it has to achieve the financial performance. Impact doesn't trump financial performance. We are always viewing them on the same plateau in terms of it must achieve both. And if it doesn't have the financial performance, we will have to take a pass, or we help that developer figure out how to make the financial piece work so we can join. But it is a balance between the two goals for sure when you're doing impact investing.
Thanks so much, Debbie. Stacy?
Yes, again, I can kind of answer that question by comparing and contrasting the approach that we take at my company, which is a private company, versus Williams at the public company that I serve as a director on. And so at Sherryland and Hunt, it's much less, at this stage of our kind of ESG journey, it's much less metric driven, because again, we don't have outside investors, it's family owned. So we measure our impact in terms of, I would describe it as kind of storytelling, in terms of telling the story of how, when we opened the LNG plant and facility that we have in Peru, how we helped, those local communities bring in freshwater sources as part of our, project. In our Sherryland utility, we measured in terms of our safety metric, our safety record, as well as how much renewable generation our transmission lines have enabled to get to the rest of Texas. And so it's a little more qualitative. I think in the private company, we don't have these very specific number thresholds that we try to report to, but we make sure that we are capturing and communicating. Again, it comes back to this communication, communicating the impact that we're having in our local communities, and how, and on our employees. In the public world, it's very different. It's very metric driven. And there are, as Danielle kind of alluded to, there are just dozens, frankly, of ESG reporting metrics that companies can choose from and follow. There's a whole debate as to whether that's really a good thing, because people tend to pick the indices that match, their company the best, so that it can kind of make them look the best. There's been some push over time that maybe we should have a more standardized ESG reporting system in the US for public companies, but that's also hard because it is very industry driven. And so it's hard to compare apples to apples across industries. But at Williams, for example, they've been very, very public in announcing that they have a ESG goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. In the near term, their goal is to reduce their carbon emissions by 56% from the 2005 levels. They measure themselves, they measure the company against several different metrics. There's one called the MSCI rating that they publish. There's another one by Sustainalytics. There's what's called the CDP disclosure system, Carbon Disclosure Project disclosure system. There's SASB, there's GRI, there's all these different sustainability indices and rating systems. And we, at Williams, they tend to kind of look at all of them and try to disclose several of them. We also, in terms of looking at, I think the harder question, as I think Danielle alluded to, is we can talk about, carbon reduction, we can talk about safety record, we can talk about our employee diversity numbers on the S part of ESG. We can talk about our governance metrics in terms of the fact that, for example, on the board of directors, we are 23% women. There's 3 women out of 13. That may not sound like a lot, but it's a lot for a public company. It's very rare to have more than 2 women on a public company board. So there are specific things like that we can report easily. I think the harder part is translating that into value. How have those things led to increased value for the company? I don't think we've quite figured that out, but one of the things that Williams does look at and report as a way of kind of measuring value is how many of our shareholders, public shareholders, are ESG funds. And so there's a chart that you can find on the Williams website it shows a dramatic increase in the number of shares owned by ESG funds as Williams has increased its ESG disclosures. And so that's one way that we know we're having an impact in terms of attracting these ESG investors into the company, which is not always easy to do for a gas company, as you can imagine. So that's one of the things that that we do to kind of show the tie to value. But that's that's a real question for companies: is what do they want to report? How do they want to measure themselves? And as I said, as of today, there's no standard for public companies that they have to report to, like there are for financial, FASB standards and that sort of thing. So that may be to come. There's always a debate about that, but today it's very voluntary, and it's, I think, just affected by what we expect what we think our shareholders expect us to report.
Thank you, Stacy. And I know I'm an auditor, so you threw me the FASB. So I appreciate that shout out to the FASB. Whitney, you're up.
Well, I think our measurement has changed over the years. In the early years, it was whether or not you actually invested your money in women-led deals. If you were raising money on that mission, then the question is, are you really doing that? There was an issue in the early 2000s that there were quite a few funds. It became in vogue to do this, but they would actually raise money, but they would not actually invest the money in women-led companies, usually under the concept of, I can't find a deal that makes sense. So our initial measurement was just the fact that we, in fact, invested in women. We said we were going to, and in fact, we did. So our measurement was rather simple. But over the years, we've also looked at what other things do we want to measure. And those were things like the fact that how many, in these funds, how many women were on the investment committee of those funds. Because we discovered if you have more women on the investment committee, you will make more investments in women-led companies. In our case, we had 6 women and 1 man. We definitely wanted to have, it was probably a little bit unbalanced in the favor of the female side, but we didn't want it all women, but, and then at times we had 2 men, but we wanted that balance. And then we started looking at how many more women can we help achieve the C-suite? And then it evolved into how many women can we help out of our group of investors, how many of those can we make available to serve on public boards? And that turned out to be a pretty fruitful activity because we had so many talented executive and professional women as investors. They also were ideal board candidates. Many of them had been CEO of large public companies or been an entrepreneur and run their own very successful private company. So we became a source of some of the local placement agencies would contact us and say, hey, we have this board position. Who in your group do you think might fill it? And we would usually have several candidates for them to seriously consider. So while that's not a direct result of our investing, it became an indirect activity and something that we could start to measure. The other thing is this again is just an additional benefit from what we were doing. One of our measurements of success was if we invested in a woman-led company and she exited that investment, would she turn around and become an investor in other women? And so we had several of those who did that. Unlike Debbie, we're not investing in real estate, so our outcomes are more unpredictable in early stage investing. And I wouldn't say that women could outperform the marketplace or whatever's happened in the general early stage marketplace. Women do not, and we're not exceeding the returns, but our goal was to see, do they have enough resources and enough ecosystem around them to support them during times of crises. We were investors in quite a few businesses that were impacted by hurricanes and 9/11, or then in the towers at 9/11. They were in New Orleans during the hurricanes. They were in Houston during some of the hurricanes. So we've been around the dips in those marketplaces. And one thing that I would say to this day, small companies, whether or not they're men or women, really suffer in these economic depressions or recessions and downturns, whether or not it's through the environment or through something that's happening locally. So it still remains a challenge for us because we need, it can provide some initial capital, but the banks have to be patient and the investor community has to be patient, and we need more resources to help these early stage environments.
Thanks, Whitney. And I know that kind of measurement and metrics has been a really challenging thing for this area, but I think it's very refreshing probably for our group to hear that there are so many different ways to measure it, the way you guys have presented. So thank you. I keep referring back to the great kind of prep call we had because it was just very insightful and I learned a lot. So we talked about some trends you've seen over time and some emerging trend that you're seeing right now in the space. So could each of you share a few of those that you think would be significant to our audience? And we'll start with Debbie.
Yes, there's a couple different trends that I'm seeing, and they're very recent and they're very good. So I'm really happy. When I launched SDS in 2001, impact investing, and Whitney has alluded to this, there just wasn't a focus. There wasn't an investor base. You literally had to go create your investor base, and it was a big educational process. In the last 2 years, of really more the last 18 months, I feel there's been more change in the perception of impact funds than the prior 18 years that I've had SDS, which is really great. Traditionally, we've had banks for our core investment category. 95% of our capital came from banks, and then about 5% from foundation endowments that are aligned with our mission. Our most recent fund, for instance, it's a fund that finances multifamily housing for our homeless population in California. We have an absolute crisis right now, 180,000 homeless individuals living on the streets. And our new fund is 106 million. We're moving up towards 150 million. And our investor base is completely different from the past 18 years. We have tech companies such as Google, Facebook, Apple that are now looking at impact investing using their corporate money. Kaiser Permanente invested 50 million into that fund. We've never worked with healthcare companies. They didn't have pots of money. But Kaiser, for instance, took 250 million just out of their nonprofit corporation and created their own impact platform, the Thriving Communities Fund, to invest in managers like us. So they, as a corporation, looked and said, we need to make a difference in poverty and homelessness. Let's take a portion of our own capital and dedicate it to that. And that fund that they've created on their own platform must generate a return. They want it to grow over time from its own return. So that is all new. We have not seen that before. In addition, just corporate stakeholders, Hudson Pacific recently, they invested in our homeless fund. They're one of the largest developers and real estate developers in the country. We fund real estate developers. We've never had a real estate developer put money into our fund, but they invested because they said, we're in LA, we see the homeless crisis every single day as we get into our cars or walk down the street and bump into another encampment. We want to make a difference, even though this is completely different from the mission of our company. They do the headquarters for tech companies and really amazing real estate developments. And they're publicly traded on top of it. So that adds a whole different level of complexity, but they carved out and invested 3 million in our fund because they said, we want to be good corporate stakeholders and our backyard has a real crisis and your impact fund is focused on it. In addition, pension funds, talk about a tremendous source of capital. Impact funds have been really difficult for pension funds to consider because of the fiduciary responsibility. But I'm thrilled to see now that our funds have a track record and we're on fund 2 of a number of strategies. Pensions are now starting to look at, and we've always said, forget we're an impact fund. Just look at our returns and look at our track record. Treat us like your regular real estate portfolio. But impact can have a perception that somehow you're loose on the financial side or you're concessionary below market. But I think that there is a mindset change of, wait, let's take a look at this and let's evaluate an impact fund the same way we would a non-impact fund and give them a chance. So I'm really excited because if there's more capital, there can be more impact funds and more tools in the toolbox attacking poverty around the country. So I'm excited about the trends I'm seeing in terms of the investors looking at creating their own platform for impact investing.
Thanks, Debbie. Danielle, what are you seeing?
Sure. So from an investor perspective, there's like three big things that, I'm watching, especially this year. So like the first is, the E, right? The environmental piece. We think it's going to get a lot of renewed attention. We've seen that just in the last couple months, right? With the new Biden administration clearly making green policies a priority. But we've also even seen, the Securities and Exchange Commission recently created a climate and ESG task force. And then other initiatives like the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which has over 3,000 investors who have signed on as signatories. Starting last year, they were required to start complying with the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So that means they're going to have to start reporting on different kind of climate risk management metrics and targets. So we're just going to see, a lot more of that. And as Stacy mentioned earlier too, we're seeing more companies make net zero commitments. And so we're just going to need to get a lot more clarity and just get our arms around all of these kind of climate risk metrics that are becoming more and more important. The second would be that the S, or the social part, is certainly here to stay. We saw it really come to the forefront in 2020 with both the COVID pandemic and then all of the renewed interest in making sure that there's social equality, right? So we saw companies that had really good, healthcare benefits or paid leave, or were, really strong on diversity, really getting a lot of attention from investors. And that's really consistent with, I think this has been mentioned already, just that shift from shareholder to a more stakeholder capitalism model, right? Where you're really concerned about not just your shareholders, but your employees, your customers, the communities, et cetera. And then the last thing I would say is just more of a shift to like a more system level thinking approach, right? So rather than being focused more on each individual element of E, S, or G, these things are really interconnected. And I think last year was a really great example of that, where just from, supply chain issues to just more system-wide risks that came to the fore, like social inequality and racial justice. These things are really interconnected. And investors are starting to think of it that way. They're going to cut across a portfolio. We need to look at it from the really big picture.
Thank you, Danielle. We're at our last question, and I'm actually going to intertwine it with one of the audience questions that we got. So if you're looking at a few different companies, why would choosing a company with an ESG or impact investing strategy make better business sense? How do these strategies kind of create value? I know you guys have already kind of touched on that throughout this, and just a couple takeaways for our participants. And the way that kind of layers into one of the questions that we got was, what kind of premiums are investors placing on ESG in an M&A transaction? So kind of all of that in the context of why a company that is pursuing these strategies. And we'll start off with Stacy on this one.
Well, that's a lot packed into one question. So, I would say a couple of thoughts for companies just trying to start on this journey would be look at your peers, really look at whether they've done reporting on this or have their own program that you can talk to them about. So that's one thing, is just start by kind of looking at what your peers are doing. The second would be talk to your employees. I really think this is something that companies miss out on sometimes. Your employees have definite views about what you should be doing in this area. And I think you can get some ideas about at least kind of where to focus, and then pick one or two things, to focus on. Don't try to just say, I'm going to have this really huge ESG strategy. And then I think you'll kind of lose focus over time if you do that. So pick a couple of things that are germane to your company where you can make improvement. In terms of the acquisition premium, I saw that question. It's a really good question. I don't have a specific numerical example or even a deal example. I can just tell you from my position in the energy industry that capital is rushing to renewable projects, for example, and rushing away from thermal generation like coal and even in some cases gas. And so while I can't, give you some sort of quantitative answer, I can just tell you that when you're looking at companies that have an ESG focus, whether it's just by nature of their business or their program, I just think you're going to attract more capital in the market the better you are at that function, because that's what investors are wanting to see today. And so I think you're going to find more value in the companies that do this well. And then takeaways in terms of trying to figure out how well companies are doing this is, I would really start to press targets. If you're looking at acquisitions or investment opportunities, press them on not just what their ESG goals are, but how are they actually going to achieve them? Because this is something that's been the case for a while in the electric industry. Is lots of companies and utilities have announced that they have a net zero by 2050 goal. Not very many of them have actually articulated how they're going to get there. And it's a lot more challenging than people think. And so I think to start to really press companies on, that's great that you have these ESG goals. Now, how are you actually going to achieve them? What's the specific steps that you're going to take to reduce your carbon to net zero by 2050? And so I think that can be applied, not just in the energy industry, but across industries, is to really start to ask them, what's your specific business plan for achieving those ESG goals? And the last thing I would just mention is going back to the prior question, I agree with Danielle on the trend of the S. And one specific trend on that folks can start to kind of look at as they investigate companies is there's a lot of pressure on companies to now start disclosing what's called their EEO Form 1 data, which is any company that has over 100 employees has to file a form with the EEOC every year that gives a very specific breakdown of the diversity of their workforce and at different levels in the company. And there's a lot of pressure for companies to start disclosing that form. And a lot of companies don't want to do that, because what it'll show for a lot of companies is that they have okay performance on diversity in the lower ranks of the company, but it doesn't make it up the chain to the senior ranks of the company. And so there's a lot of resistance to disclosing that. But I think there will be a trend on the S part of companies really being, pressured to disclose their actual diversity statistics and retention numbers as well. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Stacy. And you actually hit every single point on the compound question. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Whitney, how about you?
One of the things that we're seeing is that there are lots of new opportunities for the retail investor to have an impact through what they're doing. So I know we've talked a lot about how does a company do this, but also from the individuals on this phone call, as an executive in your company, you can look at what's our policy at our company, but also what's your policy individually. There are now opportunities to get involved in angel investing. You can target healthcare. We have some wonderful healthcare groups that focus on technology that's coming out of research institutions that can be commercialized. We invested in a technology that helps save women's lives through improved diagnostics through mammography treatments and different types of radiology. And so we know that our investing dollars have already saved some women's lives. So you can make a direct impact individually. We put together a fund that allowed people to invest between $10,000 and $150,000 per person. So someone could write a small check that they know through that investment is saving lives. So that's a pretty cool way to do it. So you as an individual on this call, don't think that it has to be your company that's involved in ESG or making impact investments. You can look for ways to do this yourself. And there's some funds, portfolio funds. I'm sure Bank of America has one. One of our investors put together a portfolio fund focused on the G, the women element of the G in ESG, and has a phenomenal return on his public portfolio. But you have to be a customer of his in order to get in. So we put together a group that could invest in a small fund that could become an investor in that fund. So look for creative ways for you to get involved as that individual, but also, start to pay attention to what impact you want to have through your investments.
Thanks so much, Whitney. Danielle?
Sure. So from an investor perspective, just thinking about what we're looking at when we invest in companies, to Stacy's point earlier, I think it's important that the things you focus on from an ESG perspective are material to your industry, right? A great resource for that is SASB's materiality map. It actually shows, like, for the specific industry you're in, what are the ESG metrics that are most relevant to your industry and will have a most impact on your bottom line. So that would be where I would start, right? Because those are the things that investors are going to focus on most. And then also to Stacey's point about it's easy to put a policy in place. It's a whole nother thing to actually implement it and do it day to day in practice. So we are seeing, I know some of the managers we're using in our client portfolios, they dig into that to say, okay, it's great you have policy, but what's your actual practice? And when they're evaluating companies, they are weighting the practice more heavily than the policy, and they're also going to weight those factors that are most material to the industry. So if you need to prioritize, those are the things I would really think about. And one quick thing to Whitney's point, just about what you can do individually. I do think that's a great way to just dig in and see what kind of ESG metrics are out there. There's so much in the public domain, right? So a couple cool resources to check out if you just kind of want to get a feel for scores and things like that, are the As You Sow is a website that actually you can screen a bunch of different kind of funds and things on different metrics. So that might be an interesting way just to check out what some of the ESG scores look like. And then as a woman, another cool thing to think about is Invest for Better, investforbetter.org, where it is all about knowing what you own and having an impact with your investments. And there's a lot of great, just open, free resources through that website too.
That's very helpful. And thank you guys both, Whitney and Danielle, for really covering the individual side of things too. That's great advice for the group. Debbie, last but not least.
Great. Well, I'll cover the institutional side for those of you who may be in government or with a corporation. The part of the question I'll focus on is why does impact investing make business sense? Well, first of all, you already have the platform. If you're in government or a corporation, you probably have a pension fund that's already doing investing. They already have their financial goals. And the pension managers, unless they're given a mandate to look at an impact funds, they probably won't. I mean, that's the reality. They're very conservative. They want to focus on the big products that are already out there that everybody else is in. If they have not been given a mandate to specifically start looking at impact funds, still underwrite them to the same degree of financial scrutiny as a non-impact fund, but at least consider them, or even set some goals, a 5-year goal. We want to have 4 or 5% of our assets in different types of impact funds. So for many that are in government or corporations, there's already a platform existing, but it is giving the direction of that platform. For those who might be with family offices or working in wealth management, it's somewhat similar of creating those goals within your own investment strategies to carve out and start thinking about how you can engage with impact funds. And again, as a reminder, engaging with impact funds doesn't mean that you have to take a haircut on your returns. If the goal is to continue, especially a public pension fund, they must achieve, their fiduciary responsibilities, market rates of return. They can't focus on the impacts and take a lower return. But there's many impact funds out there that are focused on market rates of return. So there's options out there, and you don't have to take a haircut on the returns if you're looking for a market rate fund. And that's really important for people to understand, because there's below market, and there's many funds out there in that space, and there's market rate funds. So you can find them, but there needs to be advocacy inside the organization to create these strategies. And if your pension isn't able to, you could do what Kaiser did, and you could start smaller and create your own impact pool and just say, we're going to carve out 10 million as a start. Let's do a few investments and grow it over time. So what I would say is, if this is of interest to any of you that are in these bigger organizations, become an advocate, because that's what gets the ball rolling and changes the corporate strategy. And Stacy mentioned it. Employees feel good when they know that their company is investing in these. I can't say how many times I talk to people and they work in government organization or big corporation, and they said, "Oh, do you get companies like ours to invest?" I'm like, they don't know how to look at us. And they said, "Wow, I wish my company would put our pension fund in this space." They would feel good about it. So that is an important piece as well.
Thank you, Debbie. I think that's all the time we have for questions. We were lucky that our very proactive group covered a lot of the Q&A and their answers. I want to just give a big thank you to our fantastic group of panelists. I'm just in awe of you and everything that you've been able to do. Debbie, Stacy, Danielle, and Whitney, thank you all so much for your timely insights on this important topic. And I'm going to turn it back over to Abby.
Sure. Well, Jen, great job moderating the panel. And once again, thank you to all of our panelists. We appreciate your time and your insights and just sharing with us and educating us on ESG and impact investing. So to the rest of our guests, we hope that you will all stay on for the networking portion now. If you turned off your video earlier, we'll ask you to go ahead and turn it back on as we sort you into breakout rooms. One of these days soon, we will all meet in person at the Bilo Mansion again. But in the meantime, these breakout rooms are a great opportunity to network and be together. So stand up, take a quick 7th inning stretch before